Joe Yuhan here with part 2 on pelvic rotations. Part 1, we just introduced the concept of how the pelvis needs to move and the importance of rotation. Part 2, we're going to go into 2 exercises, functional and strength-based, to both maintain and promote pelvic rotation. But before we get into that, a quick review. Why is this important? Or really, what is it? So to review, this is my pelvis bone, this is my femur bone. They both need to move for efficient athletic functional movement. And so they attach like this. And in our movement system, the femur bone has to move a lot of the ball of the femur moving in the socket of the pelvis, but the pelvis also has to move a little bit. And to review, those 8 movements are elevation, depression, internal external rotation, which is the topic of this conversation, adduction and abduction, and then lastly, flexion and extension. But we are primarily concerned with internal external rotation because that's so relevant for a lot of injury issues. And so I like to liken it to, okay, we have a car with 4 wheels and the back wheels are pointed straight. We want to drive straight ahead. We don't want, when we're driving straight ahead, to have 2 of our wheels pointed over to the right side. And that's what can happen when we get a rotated or a rotational deficit in the pelvis. That can happen through trauma. We fall, we bang in a pelvis, and the bone itself doesn't break necessarily or get bent within the bone, but its articulation on the trunk or on the sacrum bone in back can change. And that's how we can get a wheel, so to speak, that is now turned one direction. That's hugely impactful to the entire leg, because if I'm rotated out, it takes my entire leg and rotates it out, or vice versa if it's rotated in. And so it's a problem. We don't have to totally understand it, but we want to promote it or recognize it as something that we should be considering, not only from a mobility standpoint, but also an injury standpoint. Aches, pains, malalignment, stubborn range of motion loss. What's the pelvis doing? Can it rotate? So that's what we're after in this section. We're going to do 2 exercises now. The first one is going to be working on external rotation, and the second on internal rotation. Here we are on the floor to demonstrate the extreme clamshell. And so one thing you may be thinking about is, okay, if we're trying to promote pelvic bone rotation, how's it different from femur bone or hip? And they're very similar, but the strategies that we're going to do are going to involve multi-dimensional movement. And so when we go into these relative extreme movements, what we're doing is we're going to put the hip in one direction or the femur bone in one direction while we promote a movement that's slightly different in the pelvis. And that's what extreme clamshell is. So clamshells as a hip exercise is laying on your side and doing this. And by and large, the pelvis doesn't move, only the femur bone and the rest of the leg move. The extreme clamshell is really about opening the pelvis, about getting the pelvis to really maximally open in the front. And so that's looking like, if my pelvis is here, if I was standing, that's relative extreme external rotation opening from the front. We're going to do that laying down. And so I'm going to show you first in a rear view. We'll also get an overhead view, and then we'll get a side view of this exercise. And so what it is to begin with is an army crawl movement of bringing the leg up about as high as we can beside us while keeping the pelvis flat on the floor. Not letting my pelvis or my trunk come off the ground, but rather getting into this position. Now this will stretch the pelvis fairly well, but the movement we want is a then active lifting of the entire leg off of the floor. Here's our side view. So sliding the leg into this army crawl position. Then by pushing my elbows into the ground, I'm going to lift my entire leg off the ground like so. That's using the glute max primarily to do that pelvic external rotation. Lifting, and it's not much movement, And I'm a little bit stiff on this side, so this one's a little bit harder for me. But just this position is a nice opener to come into this position, hold this, but then actively lift the entire leg. And if you have trouble, then you can also put a hand here, and you can see now I'm getting a little bit more lift, a little more assist to facilitate that pelvic opening, pelvic external rotation.